December 8, 1941. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Lieutenant Commander Dudley Walker Morton stood on the deck of USS Wahoo, watching black smoke billow from the shattered Arizona just across the harbor. The morning air tasted of burning oil and cordite. Around him, the Pacific Fleet burned in its anchorage, 18 ships sunk or damaged, 2,400 Americans dead. But Morton wasn't thinking about revenge, at least not in the conventional sense. He was thinking about geography, about mathematics, about the fundamental vulnerability that would doom the Japanese Empire. Japan was an island nation with almost no natural resources of its own. Everything the Japanese Empire needed to wage war, oil from the Dutch East Indies, steel from Manchuria, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina, had to cross thousands of miles of ocean on vulnerable merchant ships. The home islands produced only 2.5% of the world's oil in 1940 while consuming far more. Japan imported 90% of its petroleum, 80% from the United States before the war. And between those conquered resources and Japan's home islands would be American submarines. Within hours of the attack, 5 hours to be precise, Admiral Harold Stark issued orders that would transform the Pacific War. All American submarines were to conduct unrestricted warfare against Japanese shipping. The international treaties governing submarine warfare, the rules about warning merchant vessels, identifying targets, ensuring crew safety, all were swept aside. No warnings, no mercy. Sink everything, flying the rising sun. What Japanese military planners didn't understand, what they couldn't have imagined despite their own nation's dependence on seaborne imports, was that this single decision would prove more devastating than any battle, any bombing campaign, any strategic masterpiece in the entire Pacific theater. The silent service would strangle Japan's war machine before the first B-29 ever darkened Tokyo's skies. Before Marines stormed Iwo Jima, before kamikazes dove at American carriers, American submarines would wage an invisible war of attrition that would make Japanese defeat mathematically inevitable. The mathematics of Japan's doom were elegantly simple and utterly unforgiving. In 1941, Japan possessed 6 million tons of merchant shipping, the accumulated wealth of decades of maritime investment. The empire imported 90% of its oil, 75% of its iron ore, and significant percentages of food, coal, and every other resource necessary for industrial warfare. The military immediately commandeered 3 million tons for operations, leaving only 3 million tons for the civilian economy. Japanese war planners understood this vulnerability. Before Pearl Harbor, they calculated they could sustain wartime operations if they maintained at least 3 million tons of operational shipping. They projected losses based on World War I experience of between 800,000 and 1 million tons in the first year, declining to 700,000 to 800,000 tons in subsequent years. These estimates assumed they could replace losses through new construction, and that Allied anti-submarine warfare would remain at 1918 levels of effectiveness. Every assumption was catastrophically wrong. Japanese shipyards could produce approximately 500,000 tons of new merchant shipping annually at peak capacity. This production rate assumed adequate steel allocation, skilled workers, and functioning infrastructure, all of which would degrade as the war progressed. American submarines would sink shipping faster than Japan could possibly replace it. The mathematics were unsustainable from the moment the first torpedo left its tube. American intelligence knew this with crystalline clarity. War Plan Orange, developed over decades of pre-war planning between the world wars, had identified Japan's vulnerability to blockade as its critical weakness. The plan called for a steady westward advance across the Pacific, seizing bases from which to interdict Japanese sea lanes. The final phase envisioned a tightening blockade that would sever Japan's oceanic trade, strangling the empire without need for invasion. What the planners hadn't anticipated was how effectively submarines alone could achieve this objective, or how quickly the campaign would devastate Japan's economy. They hadn't imagined commanders like Dudley Morton, who would take submarines into harbors and straits where doctrine said they couldn't operate. They hadn't foreseen the combination of radar, cryptanalysis, and aggressive tactics that would turn submarine warfare from hunting into systematic slaughter. On December 8, 1941, 29 submarines of the Asiatic Fleet departed Manila to intercept Japanese invasion forces steaming toward the Philippines. These boats represented the front line of American defense in the Western Pacific. Commanded by Admiral Thomas Hart, they carried America's hopes for delaying or disrupting Japanese amphibious operations. The submarines made contact with enemy shipping, maneuvered into attack positions, and fired 45 torpedoes at Japanese transports and warships. They sank exactly 3 freighters. 42 torpedoes accomplished nothing. Submarine commanders reported hearing their weapons strike enemy hulls with metallic thuds, only to watch the target sail away undamaged. Others observed torpedoes running beneath targets or exploding prematurely hundreds of yards short. A few torpedoes simply vanished, their fates unknown. The submarine force that would eventually devastate Japan's merchant marine began the war as an almost complete failure, not through lack of courage or skill, but because their primary weapon was catastrophically defective. The problem wasn't courage. Submarine crews volunteered for service, knowing they would fight in cramped steel tubes beneath the ocean, where a single mistake meant death for the entire crew. It wasn't training. American submariners underwent rigorous preparation, hundreds of hours learning their boat's systems, practicing approaches, calculating firing solutions. The problem was the Mark 14 torpedo, the most expensive, sophisticated, and catastrophically defective weapon in the American arsenal. At over $10,000 each in 1931, roughly equivalent to $180,000 in 2021 currency, the Mark 14 had been designed during the depths of the Great Depression. When a new car cost $700, the Navy was spending $10,000 on a single torpedo. This enormous cost created perverse incentives. Budget constraints meant the Navy couldn't afford to conduct extensive live fire testing. The weapons were too expensive to expend on proving whether they actually worked. The Bureau of Ordnance developed testing procedures focused more on preserving practice torpedoes than validating combat effectiveness. They prohibited submarine commanders from training with live warheads. All peacetime testing used exercise heads filled with water instead of explosives. This meant no one ever tested whether the transition from exercise head to warhead affected the torpedo's depth control. No one verified that the contact exploder functioned at combat speeds. No one confirmed the magnetic influence feature worked under battlefield conditions. The Mark 14 suffered from not one, but 3 separate crippling defects, each undiscovered because of inadequate testing, each combining to create a weapon that frequently failed to perform its basic function of exploding when it struck an enemy ship. The first defect involved depth control. The Mark 14 was designed to run at a set depth, allowing it to strike a ship's hull below the waterline where armor was thinnest. Submarine commanders could set the torpedo to run at 10 feet, 15 feet, or whatever depth tactical considerations required. The problem was that Mark 14 torpedoes consistently ran 11 feet deeper than their depth setting. A torpedo set to run at 10 feet actually traveled at 21 feet, passing harmlessly beneath the keel of most merchant ships and many warships. This defect stemmed from using exercise heads during peacetime testing. Exercise heads filled with water weighed significantly less than combat warheads filled with 600 pounds of Torpex explosive. The weight difference affected the torpedo's trim and depth control, but because no one had ever test-fired torpedoes with actual warheads, the problem went undiscovered until combat exposed it. Submarine commanders reported the depth problem within weeks of the war starting. Lieutenant Commander Tyrell Jacobs of USS Sargo documented torpedoes running too deep. Commander Pete Farrall provided detailed observations. The reports piled up at the Bureau of Ordnance, which dismissed them. BUORD insisted their torpedoes worked perfectly and blamed submarine commanders for poor shooting or equipment maintenance. Admiral Charles Lockwood, Commander Submarines Pacific Fleet, ordered comprehensive testing in June 1942. His team fired torpedoes through nets with precisely measured spacing, documenting exactly how deep the weapons ran. The results were irrefutable. Mark 14 torpedoes ran between 10 and 11 feet deeper than their settings. Lockwood reported his findings to BUORD. They rejected his conclusions on technical grounds, insisting their peacetime testing had proven the torpedoes ran true. Only when Lockwood threatened to continue testing and compile even more damning evidence did BUORD finally conduct their own evaluation. In August 1942, 8 months after Pearl Harbor, they confirmed what submarine commanders had been reporting since December. The Mark 14 ran 11 feet too deep. The fix required recalibrating the depth control mechanism, a simple modification that could have been implemented before the war if anyone had bothered to test torpedoes with warheads attached. Fixing the depth problem revealed the second defect, the magnetic influence exploder. The Mark 6 exploder incorporated cutting-edge technology designed to detonate the torpedo beneath a ship's keel, where the explosion would break the vessel's back. Rather than striking the armored side of a warship, the torpedo would pass underneath and explode when its magnetic sensor detected the steel hull's magnetic field. In theory, this was brilliant. A single torpedo exploding beneath a battleship could break its spine, sinking it instantly. In practice, the magnetic influence feature was a nightmare. The Earth's magnetic field varies by latitude and location. The magnetic signature of a ship depends on which direction it's heading, whether it's laden or empty, whether its hull is new steel or old. The exploder had been tested in the Atlantic, where magnetic conditions differed significantly from the Pacific. The magnetic influence feature caused torpedoes to explode prematurely, sometimes hundreds of yards from the target, sometimes directly beneath the launching submarine if the boat had steel components that triggered the sensor. Other times, the exploder failed completely, the torpedo passing beneath the target without detonating. Submarine commanders reported wildly inconsistent results. Perfect shots produced nothing. Other attacks generated premature explosions that alerted targets without damaging them. Admiral Ralph Christie, commanding Southwest Pacific Submarines, defended the magnetic exploder vigorously. He had participated in its development and refused to believe it was defective. But field commanders demanded the feature be disabled. Admiral Nimitz in the Pacific and Admiral Lockwood at Pearl Harbor ordered their submarines to deactivate the magnetic influence feature and rely solely on contact detonation. Disabling the magnetic feature revealed the third defect. The contact exploder itself was fundamentally flawed. The firing mechanism used a vertical firing pin that had to travel along guide rails to strike a percussion cap when the torpedo hit a target. The design dated to 1918, when torpedoes traveled at 33 knots. The Mark 14 traveled at 46 knots, generating significantly higher deceleration forces when it struck a target. At 46 knots, the impact deceleration was so severe it bent the guide rails, preventing the firing pin from reaching the percussion cap. The better the shot, the more directly the torpedo struck, the more likely the firing pin would jam. Perpendicular hits at 90 degrees, the ideal attack angle, produced dude rates of nearly 100%. Glancing hits at 45 degrees only failed 50% of the time. This meant American submarines were being punished for accuracy. Perfect shots produced duds. Imperfect shots might work. The perverse incentive frustrated commanders who had spent years training to make optimal attacks. Now they discovered that optimal attacks were the least likely to sink enemy ships. The contact exploder problem manifested most dramatically on July 24, 1943. Lieutenant Commander Dan Daspit of USS Tinosa was prowling Japanese sea lanes near Truk when he encountered the 19,000-ton tanker, Tonan Maru No. 3, dead in the water with mechanical problems. Daspit couldn't believe his luck. A sitting target, no escorts, perfect conditions for an attack. Tinosa fired 4 torpedoes from optimal range. All 4 struck the tanker's hull with solid metallic thuds clearly heard through the submarine's sonar. None exploded. Daspit closed the range and fired again. More hits, more thuds, no explosions. Over the next hour, Daspit fired 11 torpedoes at a stationary target from point-blank range under ideal conditions. All 11 struck home. Not one detonated. All were perfect duds. Daspit returned to Pearl Harbor with 1 torpedo remaining, preserving it as evidence. His after-action report detailed the entire engagement with precision. Admiral Lockwood finally had irrefutable proof that something was fundamentally wrong with the contact exploder, proof even the Bureau of Ordnance couldn't dismiss. Lockwood ordered live fire tests, actual combat conditions rather than theoretical evaluations. His team fired torpedoes with warheads attached at an underwater cliff off Kahulawi Island, then recovered the duds for examination. They also dropped torpedoes from cranes onto steel plates set at various angles, simulating different hit geometries. The tests revealed the firing pin mechanism's fatal flaw. High-speed impacts bent the guide rails, jamming the firing pin before it could strike the percussion cap. The solution came from an unexpected source. Japanese aircraft shot down at Pearl Harbor had propellers made from a lightweight aluminum alloy. This same alloy, when used to fabricate new firing pins, eliminated the binding problem. The lighter firing pins could travel the guide rails even when bent, ensuring detonation. By September 1943, 21 months after Pearl Harbor, American submarines finally had reliable torpedoes. Lieutenant Commander Frederick Warder of USS Seawolf exemplified the frustration submarine commanders experienced during those 2 years of defective weapons. Over 6 patrols, Seawolf fired 8 Mark 14 torpedoes at Japanese ships, scoring 7 misses and 1 dud hit. Warder then loaded older Mark 10 torpedoes, World War I vintage weapons the Mark 14 was designed to replace. His first 2 Mark 10 shots sank an enemy transport. The technologically inferior weapon from the previous war proved infinitely more reliable than its modern replacement. Japanese vessels occasionally pulled into port with unexploded American torpedoes embedded in their hulls, physical evidence of the Mark 14's failures. Some submarine commanders reported hearing their torpedoes strike enemy ships with solid metallic thuds, followed by nothing. No explosion, no sinking. Just the soul-destroying knowledge that a perfect shot executed flawlessly under combat conditions, had accomplished nothing. Those 21 months of defective weapons cost lives, wasted patrols, and allowed countless Japanese ships to escape destruction. 20 of the 53 American submarines lost during the war were sunk before September 1943, when reliable torpedoes finally became available. While it's impossible to know how many were lost due to faulty weapons, forcing them to make additional attacks or remain on station longer than necessary, the correlation is suggestive. Submarines with defective torpedoes had to take more risks to achieve results, exposing themselves to enemy counterattack repeatedly. But once the problems were solved, once submarine commanders could trust their weapons to explode when they struck targets, the silent service unleashed a campaign of destruction that would shatter Japan's economy and doom its military machine. The pent-up frustration, the accumulated tactical knowledge, the practiced skills of 2 years of combat, all focused through the lens of weapons that finally worked as designed. Commander Richard O'Kane understood what reliable torpedoes meant. As executive officer of USS Wahoo under Dudley Morton, O'Kane had pioneered aggressive surface attack tactics that terrified Japanese shipping. When given command of USS Tang in October 1943, he refined those tactics into a system of devastating efficiency. Tang's third war patrol into the Yellow Sea became the most successful submarine deployment in American history. In one day, June 24, 1944, Tang sank 4 Japanese ships, including Tomahoko Maru, Tainan Maru, Nasusan Maru, and Kenichi Maru. Over the patrol's duration, Tang destroyed 10 vessels totaling 39,000 tons. O'Kane employed tactics that seemed suicidal but proved devastatingly effective. He positioned Tang in the middle of convoys, firing at ships ahead and behind, counting on the submarine's low profile and superior speed to evade escorts. He attacked on the surface at night, using Tang's superior radar to locate targets while remaining invisible to Japanese lookouts. He closed to point-blank range, sometimes less than 500 yards, to ensure every torpedo found its mark. Tang's success represented the maturation of American submarine warfare. Early war doctrine had envisioned submarines as cautious scouts operating on the fringes of fleet actions. Reality demanded aggressive commanders willing to take Tang into the heart of enemy formations, accepting risks that peacetime training had never contemplated. But individual submarine achievements, spectacular as they were, told only part of the story. The real devastation came from scale. By 1944, American shipyards were producing submarines faster than Japan could build merchant ships to replace those being sunk. The Gato and Balao class submarines, rugged, reliable, and equipped with increasingly sophisticated radar and fire control systems, prowled Japanese waters with impunity. Japan began the war with approximately 6 million tons of merchant shipping. The military immediately commandeered half for troop transport and supply operations. This left only 3 million tons for civilian economy, importing food, fuel, and raw materials for war industries. Japanese planners calculated they needed to maintain at least 3 million tons of shipping to sustain both military operations and the home economy. American submarines systematically destroyed that calculation. In 1942, submarines sank 139 Japanese merchant ships, totaling 560,000 tons. In 1943, the toll rose to 305 ships, over 1,300,000 tons. In 1944, submarines destroyed 565 ships, totaling 2,480,000 tons. The Japanese simply could not replace these losses. Their shipyards produced approximately 500,000 tons of new merchant shipping annually. American submarines were destroying that amount every 4 months by 1943. The mathematics were unsustainable. Every sunk tanker meant less oil for the combined fleet. Every destroyed freighter meant fewer supplies for forward bases. Every lost transport meant trapped troops unable to reinforce critical positions. The human cost of Japan's merchant marine losses was staggering. Allied submarines sank an estimated 44 troop ships with greater than 1,000 casualties each. Tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers drowned when their transports were torpedoed, never reaching the battlefields where they were desperately needed. This invisible attrition crippled Japan's ability to move forces between theaters or reinforce island garrisons. Perhaps most critically, submarines severed Japan's oil lifeline. Japan imported oil from the Dutch East Indies after seizing those oil fields in Tipahas, early 1942. The fields produced 65 million barrels annually, more than enough to meet Japan's needs. But production meant nothing if tankers couldn't deliver oil to Japan. American submarines hunted tankers with particular intensity. Each tanker sinking represented not just lost cargo, but lost irreplaceable specialized shipping. Japan began the war with 49 large tankers. By mid-1944, submarines had sunk most of them. The Japanese desperately converted merchant ships to carry oil, but these improvised tankers lacked proper pumps and storage systems, making them inefficient and dangerous. The statistics tell the story of Japan's fuel starvation. In 1943, Japan imported 4 million barrels of oil per month from the Southern Resource Zone. In 1944, imports fell to 1,400,000 barrels monthly. By early 1945, virtually nothing was getting through. The last tanker from Southeast Asia reached Japan in March 1945. Without fuel, the combined fleet became trapped. Major warships spent 1944 and 1945 based in Singapore or Tawi-Tawi, close to fuel sources but far from decisive action. When the fleet did sortie, fuel shortages limited operations. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Japanese battleships and cruisers had barely enough fuel for a one-way mission. They planned to beach themselves as shore batteries if they survived the battle, having insufficient fuel to return to base. The submarine campaign's effectiveness stemmed from multiple factors beyond reliable torpedoes. American submarines employed radar that allowed night surface attacks. Japanese anti-submarine warfare remained primitive throughout the war, lacking adequate sonar, depth charges set to proper depths, and convoy escort doctrine. Most remarkably, American cryptanalysts provided submarines with decoded Japanese shipping movement orders. The Ultra Intelligence Program allowed submarine commanders to position themselves along convoy routes with perfect foreknowledge of targets. Some submarines received orders directing them to specific latitude and longitude coordinates where Japanese ships would appear at predicted times. It was less hunting than harvesting. Japanese anti-submarine efforts proved catastrophically inadequate. Unlike the Allies in the Atlantic, who developed sophisticated convoy systems, coordinated air cover, and specialized escort vessels, Japan never prioritized merchant ship protection. The Imperial Navy focused on fleet actions and offensive operations, viewing convoy escort as defensive and therefore dishonorable. Japanese destroyers, designed for fleet combat, made poor convoy escorts. They lacked the endurance for extended patrol, the specialized equipment for submarine hunting, and the numbers to provide adequate protection. Japan produced approximately 6,000 submarine-killing depth charges during the entire war. Britain produced that many in a single month. The consequences were predictable. American submarines attacked Japanese convoys with near impunity. A typical attack involved the submarine tracking the convoy submerged, plotting firing solutions on multiple targets, then surfacing to fire spreads of torpedoes before diving to evade escorts. Japanese escorts, if present, would drop inadequate depth charges set too shallow to damage submarines at proper diving depth. One particularly devastating element of the submarine campaign involved attacks on hellships, transports carrying Allied prisoners of war. Submarines had no way of knowing these ships carried Allied personnel. Japanese vessels carrying POWs displayed no markings, traveled in regular convoys, and were legitimate military targets. When torpedoed, these ships became mass graves. Thousands of Allied prisoners drowned in the holds of sinking transports, victims of Japan's refusal to mark POW ships and the brutal efficiency of American torpedoes. By early 1945, Japan's shipping situation had become catastrophic. Coastal shipping between Japanese home islands, previously considered safe, now required armed escorts. Small boats and wooden junks replaced steel freighters. Fishermen feared going to sea. Every ship that survived a voyage was a miracle. The submarine blockade combined with aerial mining to create a stranglehold that left Japan gasping. In March 1945, Admiral Chester Nimitz requested that B-29 bombers conduct aerial mining operations to complement the submarine campaign. General Curtis LeMay, commanding the 21st Bomber Command, enthusiastically agreed. On March 27, 1945, 102 B-29 superfortresses dropped 825 mines in the Shimonoseki Strait, the critical waterway between Honshu and Kyushu. Operation Starvation, as the mining campaign was designated, expanded rapidly. B-29s dropped magnetic, acoustic, and pressure-sensitive mines equipped with delayed arming mechanisms and ship count devices. The mines offered over 200 possible combinations, making Japanese minesweeping efforts nearly futile. Between March and August 1945, B-29s flew over 1,500 mining sorties, dropping more than 12,000 mines across Japanese home waters. The impact was immediate and devastating. Shipping through Shimonoseki Strait dropped from 70,000 tons daily in March to 1,750 tons in June. By July, Japanese maritime traffic had virtually ceased. Ports were paralyzed for weeks at a time while minesweepers attempted to clear channels. Nearly 90% of Japan's 22 ship repair yards were blockaded by mines, stranding damaged vessels. The combined submarine and aerial mining campaign sank or damaged over 960 ships, totaling more than 2 million tons in the last 6 months of the war. Aerial mines alone accounted for 60% of Japanese shipping losses between March and August 1945. The cost to American forces was 15 B-29s lost and 103 airmen killed, a microscopic price compared to the devastation inflicted. The strategic consequences of the blockade manifested everywhere. Japanese aircraft sat grounded for lack of aviation fuel. Tank units trained with wooden mock-ups because no gasoline existed for actual tanks. Industrial production collapsed as factories ran out of raw materials. Rice imports ceased, forcing Japan to implement harsh rationing that left civilians consuming less than 1,480 calories daily by mid-1945. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted after the war, concluded that the submarine campaign alone could have forced Japanese surrender, even without invasion, atomic bombs, or Soviet intervention. The survey estimated that blockade had reduced Japan's ability to wage war more effectively than strategic bombing, at a fraction of the cost in lives and resources. Consider the numbers. The submarine force represented only 2% of the American military in the Pacific. Yet submarines sank 55% of all Japanese shipping destroyed by United States forces. Over 1,500 Japanese merchant ships, totaling more than 5 million tons, were sent to the ocean floor by American torpedoes. An additional 686 Japanese naval vessels, including 1 battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, and 11 cruisers, were destroyed by submarines. The human cost to the silent service was severe. Of the 16,000 men who served in submarines during the Pacific War, 3,750 never returned. 52 American submarines were lost, most with all hands. The submarine service suffered the highest casualty rate of any American military branch, 22% killed in action. But those casualties purchased victory on a scale unmatched by any other force. USS Flasher sank 100,000 tons of shipping. USS Rasher destroyed 99,000 tons. Tang, Silversides, Spadefish, Trigger, and dozens of other boats compiled kill records that dwarfed anything achieved by surface ships or aircraft in terms of tonnage destroyed per unit committed. The most successful submarine commanders became legends. Richard O'Kane's 33 ships sunk placed him first among American submarine captains. Eugene Fluckey of USS Barb conducted raids on Japanese coastal installations, even landing shore parties to blow up trains. Samuel Dealey of USS Harder sank 5 Japanese destroyers in 4 days, terrorizing Japanese anti-submarine forces. These individual achievements, spectacular as they were, represented only the visible peak of a campaign that systematically dismantled Japan's ability to wage war. Every freighter sunk meant less food for Japanese civilians. Every tanker destroyed meant fewer sorties for Japanese aircraft. Every transport torpedoed meant fewer reinforcements for desperate island garrisons. Japanese military planners had assumed American submarines would operate cautiously, as doctrine suggested. They never anticipated commanders like O'Kane, Morton, Fluckey, and Dealey, who brought their boats into the middle of enemy formations and fired until their torpedo tubes were empty. They didn't expect American industrial capacity to produce submarines and torpedoes faster than Japan could replace shipping losses. They couldn't imagine cryptanalysis that would turn submarine warfare from hunting to assassination. By August 1945, Japan was dying from strangulation. Oil imports had ceased. Food shipments had stopped. The home islands were cut off from the empire they had conquered. Civilian population faced starvation. Industrial production had collapsed to a fraction of wartime peak. The combined fleet, once the terror of the Pacific, sat immobilized in port for lack of fuel. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, he cited multiple factors: the atomic bombings, Soviet entry into the war, the impossibility of continuing the conflict. But Japanese military and civilian leaders interviewed after the war consistently identified the blockade, the destruction of merchant shipping, as the decisive factor in Japan's defeat. Vice Admiral Hoshina, chief of the Naval Affairs Bureau, was asked why Japan went to war with the United States. His answer was simple: the stoppage of oil imports. Without them, Japan could not survive. When asked why Japan surrendered, his answer was equally direct: because submarines and mines had accomplished what the American oil embargo threatened. They had cut off Japan's lifeline. The submarine blockade of Japan remains one of the least celebrated and most decisive campaigns of World War II. While Midway, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa dominate popular memory, the silent service waged a war of attrition that made Japanese defeat mathematically inevitable. Before the first B-29 dropped incendiaries on Tokyo, submarines had already won the economic war that would determine the Pacific conflict's outcome. The campaign's success validated pre-war planning that identified blockade as Japan's critical vulnerability. It demonstrated that modern warfare required not just battlefield victories, but systematic destruction of enemy economic capacity. Most significantly, it proved that a relatively small force, properly employed with adequate weapons and intelligence support, could achieve strategic results disproportionate to its size. Today, the lessons of the submarine blockade remain relevant. Island nations dependent on imported resources remain vulnerable to sea denial operations. Control of sea lanes continues to determine economic viability. The ability to strangle an enemy's economy through blockade offers strategic leverage that transcends battlefield dominance. The silent service achieved what conventional forces could not. They made every Japanese ship a potential target. They turned the Pacific Ocean from Japan's moat into its prison. They proved that industrial warfare ultimately comes down to mathematics, and Japan's numbers simply didn't add up once American submarines controlled the sea lanes. In the end, the submarine campaign demonstrated a fundamental truth about modern war. Victory doesn't always go to the Army with the most soldiers, or the Navy with the biggest ships. Sometimes it goes to the force that can systematically destroy the enemy's ability to sustain operations. American submarines didn't just sink ships. They sank Japan's capacity to wage war. They starved the empire before the bombers ever arrived. And that starvation, quiet, methodical, and utterly devastating, proved more decisive than any battle ever fought in the Pacific theater. If you found this deep dive into the Silent Service's war against Japan fascinating, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from World War II. We explore the campaigns, the technology, and the human experiences that shaped history's greatest conflict. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our next video, and let us know in the comments what aspect of the Pacific War you'd like us to cover next. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.